Meet our necromancer protagonist Song, who is extremely weak until he gains the system and the ability to make his own copies. Using this cheat ability, he becomes a max-level necromancer with unlimited summons. But on top of that, he also becomes the #1 hero and a Demon King-level vampire. Guys, that was the intro. Help us get 669 likes. And let's begin. The next morning, an official arrives to visit the protagonist, Han Song-hyun, announcing he's from the Special Investigations Department of the Ability Management Bureau. Han Song-hyun, looking as though he hasn't seen daylight in weeks, gives the investigator an uncertain look. The investigator confirms Han Song-hyun's identity and informs him that he must report to the Bureau if he awakens any abilities. With that, the investigator leaves, as Han Song-hyun reveals he had an encounter with an outsider after half a year. Which means, as Han Song-hyun grabs snacks from the fridge, he won't have to open his front door for another 6 months. He gives an annoyed look, realizing the snacks are expired since he hasn't been shopping or outside for 2 years. Han Song-hyun admits that people would call him pathetic or weak-willed. However, he believes he's simply a victim of this cursed world. Right then, breaking news appears on the TV, reporting a fire at a shopping complex caused by an awakened individual. Awakened is the term used for people who suddenly inherit mysterious powers, known as abilities. Once someone awakens, they are forcibly transported to another world within 24 hours. However, if they meet certain conditions, they can return to Earth, though only a small fraction has managed to survive and come back. Just like the awakened man who set fire to the complex, many who awaken commit crimes before being transported to another world. 2 years ago, in a similar incident, Han Song-hyun lost his legs as a victim. Despite that, he didn't give up and tried everything to make his legs fine again. However, every attempt was futile, and Han Song-hyun eventually gave up, not wanting to try so hard when there was no effect. Now, Han Song-hyun is so terrified that he can't even step outside his door, wondering if things would be different had he shown more courage. If only he could muster the strength to leave his room and go anywhere. Suddenly, a system interface appears before Han Song-hyun, startling him as he begins to awaken a unique skill. Seeing himself about to awaken, Han Song-hyun is utterly baffled. The unique skill he awakens is Avatar, and now that he has awakened, his countdown to be transported to another world begins. 24 hours left. Han Song-hyun remains shocked, wondering why he awakened so suddenly, without any warning. A system warning informs Han Song-hyun that if he doesn't enter the transfer zone within the time limit, he will be forced there. Panicking, he scrambles to prepare, shouting in frustration. He rummages through his drawers, recalling that once transferred, it usually takes a year to return to Earth, with time moving 10 times slower in the other world. This means Han Song-hyun would need to survive in that world for at least 10 years, something he's unsure he can do. With only 3 minutes remaining until the transfer, Han Song-hyun is fully dressed and prepared for the journey, his heart pounding in anticipation. Anxiously, he moves his leg toward the transfer zone but quickly pulls it back, overwhelmed by anxiety, for he hasn't even stepped outside in years. On top of that, without any powers or skills, he knows his chances of survival in another world are slim, which terrifies him. Suddenly, he remembers something. He does have powers now. Didn't he just awaken? Determined to find out what his ability is, Han Song-hyun shouts, commanding his avatar skill to activate. Right then, a clone of his appears before him. Seeing himself standing there, Han Song-hyun is startled. He feels a sharp pain in his eyes, and suddenly, he can see 2 versions of his own face. Realizing something, Han Song-hyun turns his back to his clone, and they stand back to back with each other. Now, he confirms that he is actually sharing his vision with the avatar. He begins feeling dizzy, realizing that moving 2 bodies separately while controlling both at the same time might be impossible. Suddenly, the system issues a warning that only 1 minute remains until transfer. Han Song-hyun thinks this ability is useless, and since he was already useless before, it just makes him feel even more helpless. He wonders if there could be someone who could go in his place to the other world. Staring at his avatar, Han Song-hyun gets an idea. Someone else can indeed go in his place. So, Han Song-hyun instructs his avatar to step into the transfer zone, and the system begins initiating the transfer. Han Song-hyun closes his eyes, praying that this plan will work. Miraculously, the plan succeeds, and the system announces that the transfer has begun. Han Song-hyun recoils in shock, unable to believe that it actually worked. The transfer zone has recognized the avatar as the real Han Song-hyun. Moments later, the avatar is successfully transported to the Out-Erica dimension. Upon arriving in the other world, the avatar finds itself standing in a thick forest. Looking a bit puzzled, the avatar begins checking its hands and the surroundings. However, Han Song-hyun soon realizes that the avatar is him in this other world, leaving him shocked. The system informs Han Song-hyun that he can return to Earth using the return option in the karma shop, where karma can be collected. However, Han Song-hyun's current karma is 0. Suddenly, Han Song-hyun feels a sharp pain in his eyes and realizes he's seeing 2 locations at once, confirming he's not physically in the other world but sharing a vision with his avatar. This double vision makes him dizzy, and he shouts in frustration before canceling the summon. After doing so, Han Song-hyun finds himself back in his room, with the double vision disappearing. Feeling sick, he rushes to the bathroom and throws up into the toilet. Despite everything, Han Song-hyun feels relieved that he dodged the transfer crisis, and raises his hand to summon the avatar back. The avatar appears right before him again, and he realizes that he might be in serious trouble. Staring at the avatar, Han Song-hyun wonders what he can even do with this seemingly useless ability from now on. Right then, the system congratulates Han Song-hyun for achieving a great feat, returning to Earth without using the karma shop. For this, the system rewards him with a special item, the Dimensional Transfer Gate, which allows him to travel to a previously visited location once a day. In addition, his karma increases significantly, and this is how Han Song-hyun became the Awakener who returned to Earth in the shortest time ever. The current karma Han Song-hyun got awarded is 1.9 million. This means, just for summoning the avatar, he got awarded 10 years worth of points all at once. Karma is paid based on the impact one has in the other world, like good deeds, bad deeds, killing, hard work, etc. The accumulated karma can then be used to strengthen one's skills or return back to Earth. Seeing this much karma in his balance, Han Song-hyun wonders if this is an error, fearing that the officials might ask him to give it back. But he reassures himself that it's not like he messed up on purpose, and since he is on Earth, the return is meaningless, so he goes to the shop and sees there's an enhanced status option. Clicking on this option, another option, Enhanced Recovery Power, pops up, costing 10,000 karma. Curious about what it is, Han Song-hyun clicks on it as well, and suddenly he feels a strange sensation in his legs. He realizes his leg injury is recovering. 2 years ago, when Han Song-hyun was injured, it impacted his life greatly, and he even bid farewell to his family. That injury was the scar that confined him to his room. And right now, everything is about to change, as the system notifies him that his power has surpassed the standard level. Because of that, Han Song-hyun ends up getting another skill, Super Recovery. That night, Han Song-hyun is making full use of his recovered and now even stronger legs, using them to exercise, which he couldn't before. Now more cheerful, he notes that he still has a lot of remaining karma, so he goes through the shop and sees the Enhanced Possessed Skill option for 300,000 karma. A bit excited, he clicks on it, looking forward to seeing what he will be able to do if he enhances his avatar skill. After that, he summons the avatar and examines him, and this time, the avatar compliments Han Song-hyun as if it's a separate person. Realizing his consciousness has split into 2, Han Song-hyun feels a surge of happiness, now able to move freely without sharing visions with the avatar. On top of that, Han Song-hyun also obtains a new skill, the Mind Hub, which lets him filter out his emotions. This means that he won't feel any sickness from the dimensional travel, and he also won't feel any pain if his avatar gets hurt. This also means that Han Song-hyun can now venture into the other world from the comfort of his room. He can now control his avatar as if he's playing a video game. To make things even more absurd, Han Song-hyun now has 2 avatars instead of 1. A little confused by this, Han Song-hyun wonders if his avatars will keep increasing as he grows. Anyways, he decides to give his avatars different names, and he goes into deep thought, trying to think of names. He notices the coffee cup and gets an idea, naming the first avatar Hans, who has the individual trait of mana affinity. The other avatar, Han Song-hyun, names Heinz, whose individual trait is durability. Seeing the mana affinity and durability, Han Song-hyun thinks both avatars are duds. With everything now settled, Han Song-hyun decides to start the main quest and sends Hans to the other world. Meanwhile, Heinz picks up the year's worth of trash bags and heads outside to drop them off. As Hans gets teleported, Heinz opens the main door, causing sunlight to flood the room. Unlike before, Han Song-hyun doesn't feel anxious at all, which means the mind hub skill is properly active. Han Song-hyun then shifts his mind to Hans, who must have arrived in the other world by now. Teleporting to the other world, Hans finds himself standing in the middle of a forest, and it's already night there. Hans hopes nothing dangerous will come at him in this peaceful-looking forest, but to his horror, a black panther with glowing eyes appears right in front of him, startling him. The panther lunges at Hans, its sharp and large claws out as Hans reaches for his sword. Pulling out the sword, Hans raises it right before his face, and the panther, aiming for Hans's throat, bites hard on the sword. Smelling the panther's breath, Hans finds it nasty. Reacting swiftly, Hans recoils a bit and raises his sword, using mana injection on it, causing it to glow faintly. He then swings the sword at the panther, driving it right into the beast, killing it on the spot. Looking at the sword covered in blood, Hans thinks he is still weak and notes that if he encounters a stronger monster, he'll be in big trouble. Right then, Hans sees some structures looking like houses a little further away on his right. It appears to be a small village set on the edge of a cliff. Once Hans arrives at the village, an old bald man, Malcolm, the village chief, welcomes Hans. Malcolm seems impressed with Hans for passing through this dangerous forest at such a late hour, while Hans, laughing, says he is covered in wounds. Hans then asks Malcolm if he can stay in the village for just one night. Malcolm agrees to let Hans stay, and Hans, relieved, thanks Malcolm gratefully. Malcolm claims he's never seen someone like Hans before and asks if he came from far away, and Hans says he got lost after wandering around. Malcolm, glad to see an outsider, offers to buy Hans a drink at the village tavern. Later that night, lying on his back in bed, Hans reflects on the empty room Malcolm provided and agrees the village people are kind-hearted. Yawning loudly, he feels really tired despite the fun day and goes to sleep, unaware of someone standing at the corner of the room, stalking him. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Han Song-hyun raises a glass, celebrating his new life after having showered and eaten chicken. Turning sideways, he guiltily admits he feels a bit sorry for Heinz, though. Heinz is doing heal training to utilize his durability skill, and Han Song-hyun is still not sure when he will dispatch Heinz. While his clones are working hard, Han Song-hyun decides to find out more about what's going on in this world and what kind of world the other one is. This will be like Han Song-hyun playing the role of the perfect commander-in-chief. Suddenly, he gets a strange and ominous feeling. Right then, the system notifies Han Song-hyun that his avatar has died, and all the traits and accumulated data of the avatar will be reset. Learning that Hans has died, Han Song-hyun is bewildered as shock hits him. Learning that Hans has died, Han Song-hyun is hit with major shock, leaving him completely bewildered. The last place Hans was seen alive was the village, and he died there. This means the old village chief must be behind it all, and Han Song-hyun wonders if the drink Hans was given had been spiked. Han Song-hyun admits that he got too complacent in an unfamiliar place and starts feeling a headache, which helps him reconnect with Hans. Meanwhile, in the other world, the chief Malcolm is speaking to another man, saying he thought Hans would be useful but turned out to be plain. Malcolm claims he thought Hans would have been talented, given he passed through the forest alone. The two men are looking down at Hans, but he's no longer himself. He has now turned into a skeleton. As Hans wakes up, Han Song-hyun on Earth also realizes that his hand has turned into a skeleton. The system announces that Hans's race has now changed to undead, and he has obtained a special skill called Decomposed Heart. Hans is shocked as he processes the fact that he has now become an undead. The system explains that Hans became undead, and thanks to Mind Hub, his mind hasn't been corrupted. Looking around, Hans wonders where he is and what is happening. Suddenly, he notices a dozen other skeletons standing nearby the wall, which frightens him. He realizes that those bastards are likely turning the entire village into undead. At that moment, another man walks down the stairs into the warehouse where the undead are kept. Hans recognizes him as the same guy from the tavern yesterday. Walking into the warehouse, the man broods about how long he has to be stuck in this remote mountain area. He then spots Hans sitting on the floor, his back resting against the wall. The man narrows his eyes at Hans, making Hans nervous, worried that he might have been spotted moving. Irritated, the man asks why this undead is out of place and points ahead, ordering Hans to move over there. Realizing the man hadn't actually seen him move, Hans feels relieved, but suddenly his legs begin to move on their own, as if controlled by the man. Although he could resist, he decides it's best to follow. The man complains about why the old man always orders him to check on these undead and grumbles about it. As the man leaves, slamming the door behind him, Hans finds the power the man used on him familiar. Hans is sure it's similar to the mana affinity trait and figures out how it works. He then wonders if he can use this same power to control all the undead in this chamber. A week later, inside a dark room, Hans sits cross-legged on some boxes, looking down at another undead sitting below. Hans focuses, staring intently at the undead, and his eyes suddenly begin glowing with blue mana. The undead rises before Hans, and seeing this, he feels a surge of happiness at successfully controlling his first undead. But as the undead starts dancing, Hans thinks he did a clumsy job. He notes he can only control one undead at a time and wonders if it's the limit for an elite skeleton. Suddenly startled by a squeak, Hans looks down and sees a rat crawling past his legs. With quick reflexes, he grabs the rat between his bony fingers, holding it by the tail, recognizing it as the same rat that's been bothering him for a week. Hans had trouble catching the rat because it's small and fast, but suddenly, he gets an idea. Raising his other hand, Hans uses the mana affinity trait, deciding to take the rat under his control. The rat squeaks as Hans infuses mana into it. For a moment, the rat appears dead in Hans's hand, with a large wound near its stomach. But after a while, the rat's eyes begin to glow, and it comes back to life. Seeing this, Hans is excited that his plan worked. He then names the rat Alfred and sends it on a mission to stalk the humans and overhear their conversations. Following Hans's orders, the rat sneaks around the place unnoticed. The man from earlier, who checked on the undead, is still complaining, cursing the old man for giving him duties. The man begins unlocking a door, and Hans wonders what might be inside, deciding to follow the man. As soon as the door opens, a terrifying aura escapes, so powerful that even Han Song-hyun feels chills. Hans quickly makes the rat return, sensing it's too dangerous to get closer. A few minutes later, Alfred overhears the man talking to another about when the ripening process will end. The man says he feels like his lifespan is being drained every time he enters the room, and the second man reassures him it should be over soon. The first man grumbles that it's not right for them to guard this side too, and they've also set traps in every building as if anyone would sneak in. Hearing this, Hans realizes that the ominous thing he sensed earlier must be the fragment of the immortal king. He wonders where he can send the rat to gather more information, thinking the chief might know, when suddenly, a dagger pierces the rat out of nowhere. Blood spills from Alfred as the figure who killed him walks forward. It's the village chief, Malcolm, who exclaims he thought it was someone else, but it's only a rat. Kneeling down to examine the rat, Malcolm sees that it's an undead and filled with dark mana. Malcolm wonders if this rat turned into an undead naturally, as there's only one place in the village overflowing with dark mana. Malcolm then confronts the two men who were chatting and asks who was responsible for guarding the warehouse today. The rat, Alfred, is dead, and Hans vows to avenge him. Later that day, Jeffy storms into the warehouse, kicking the door open angrily and shouting at the old chief for blaming him for letting a rat crawl out. Jeffy, face filled with rage, points to an undead sticking out of line and commands it to stand properly. He walks toward the undead, cursing angrily, and punches it hard in the face. As the undead falls to the ground, Jeffy leans down, grabbing its hair. Lifting the undead's face, Jeffy sneers, saying this is the man who dared to rebel against him before. With an evil grin, Jeffy taunts the undead to say what it said back then but laughs, knowing the undead's tongue has been removed. Finding it no longer fun, Jeffy pushes the undead back to the ground. Taking a few steps ahead, Jeffy reminisces about how fun it was when he was hunting down every person in the village. The undead, lying on the ground, begins moving its hand while Jeffy approaches a female undead, who he says is the wife of the undead on the ground. Suddenly, the undead rises to its feet and lunges at Jeffy from behind. Jeffy screams as he falls to the ground, clutching the wound on his neck where the undead bit him. As the undead walks toward Jeffy, he tries his best to command it to stop. With one hand pressing his wound, Jeffy raises his other hand, ready to use a spell. But before he can utter any words, another undead grabs him from behind, silencing him. Unable to speak or move, Jeffy watches in horror as every undead in the warehouse comes at him, ending his life. Hans, standing at the end of the line, with his eyes glowing, notes that this is just the beginning of the victim's revenge. Outside the village's entrance, a man tries to convince the guards to let him in to retrieve his younger siblings, but they say everyone has left. The man insists, stating he wants to see the chief, while the guards refuse to let outsiders enter the village. While the man and the guards argue, someone arrives, asking what all the commotion is about. The village chief, Malcolm, introduces himself to the man. Upon seeing the chief, the man greets him, and the chief asks who he is. Heinz smiles and says he is looking for his twin sibling, Hans, who was in this village. Having two bodies comes in handy in moments like this, as Hans manages to enter the room containing the fragment of the immortal king while Heinz keeps the chief busy. Looking up at the fragment of the immortal king, Hans feels the overwhelming power radiating from it. He wonders if the fragment absorbs the dark energy from the undead nearby, but dismisses it, believing it resonates to fill what's lacking instead. However, the other undead in this room appear much stronger than those in the previous warehouse, possibly kept there because of that. This frustrates Hans, who notes that one shouldn't be picky with their meals as he grabs the fragment with his bare hands. As the dark power begins radiating all around Hans, he looks forward to seeing how this will affect him. The fragment emits a bright and blinding flash of light, releasing even more dark mana. Meanwhile, outside the village entrance, Heinz continues to convince the guards and the chief that Hans is his twin. Heinz claims that because they are twins, they can always sense where the other one is, but the chief finds that hard to believe. Suddenly, the chief feels something and shouts that something is wrong with the fragment. He transforms into a salamander-like monster and rushes back to the warehouse while ordering the guards to kill Heinz. Heeding the chief's orders, the guards raise their spears at Heinz, ready to attack him. However, they get startled when they see Heinz has disappeared right before their eyes. At this moment, Hans feels an overwhelming flood of negative emotions rushing into his head relentlessly. With both hands pressed hard on his head, Hans experiences intense despair, despite the Mind Hub skill being active. He wonders if anyone in the world could withstand these emotions without losing their sanity as he lets out a scream of terror. His head becomes so crammed with negative emotions that it literally explodes, releasing dark mana. Seconds later, the system notifies Hans that he has met the conditions and is evolving. Now, Hans has evolved into an immortal mage, and his rank has increased due to the power of the fragment of the immortal king. He also gains the new special skill, Evil Wisdom, which grants him absolute understanding talent in dark magic. Meanwhile, a guard outside the warehouse sighs, cursing Jeffy for landing him in this mess. At that moment, the village chief contacts the man telepathically, shouting at him. Startled, the man contacts the chief back, assuring him that nothing is wrong. The chief instructs the man to check the fragment and contact Jeffy, who shouts down at the warehouse, urging Jeffy to check the fragment quickly. However, Jeffy doesn't respond, so the man grabs onto the bars, asking if Jeffy can hear him. Looking through the door, the man sees a dark figure engulfed in bright light. He shouts through the bars, thinking it's Jeffy, and asks why he isn't answering. As undead hands emerge from the bars, trying to grab the man, he becomes completely baffled. Terrified, the man recoils back, letting out a squeal of fright. Hans, from inside the room, speaks out, asking the man if the weather is nice today. Seeing the skeleton talk, the man thinks he must be going crazy. With a frightened and disgusted look, he raises his hand and summons dark magic flames above his palms. He then shoots the flames at the door, shouting at the undead to get lost. Suddenly, the door crashes open and falls on top of the man, catching him by surprise. The undead flood out of the room, and Hans walks out along with them, saying that ignoring his greeting hurt him. Raising his hand, Hans uses the dark magic the man had used earlier, noting that due to evil wisdom, he can use any spells just by looking at them. A massive explosion shakes the entire village, and the other men outside get on high alert. Walking outside, Hans commands the other undead to come forth. He then orders the undead to not let a single person in this village escape and to finish them off. Following Hans's command, the undead charge forward, and suddenly a large explosion occurs on the other side of the village. The explosion sends one of the undead flying backward, landing right before Hans and startling him. The chief, who just caused the explosion, points a finger at Hans, telling him he should have definitely become an elite skeleton. Now in his true form, the chief asks Hans what he did with the fragment of the immortal king. Hans points out that it's been a long time and asks the chief if he remembers him. Hans states that thanks to the chief, he lost his heart. Thus, Hans reveals the fragment, placed where his heart should be, claiming he picked this new heart from the warehouse. Seeing the fragment, the chief snarls his teeth in rage, stating that Hans fused the fragment with such a lowly body. Raising his hand to the sky with a finger pointing up, the chief curses Hans to die while using a dark spell. A black magic bolt, shaped like lightning, flies toward Hans, striking his left arm and causing it to break off. As his severed skeleton arm falls away behind him, Hans asks the chief if he doesn't know it's polite not to attack when someone is talking. His eyes glowing red with anger, the chief shouts at Hans to shut up, claiming he's poured every resource he had for a year into this maturation process. Shooting more dark spells at Hans, the chief insists he was so close to becoming the strongest of all, which has now been ruined. The dark magic flying toward Hans merges and turns into a massive sharp thorn, engulfed in dark mana. Observing this type of dark magic, Hans thinks it's like putting a high-tier enchantment on a beginner's club. Nevertheless, Hans confidently states that he's the only one who can make this work as he nullifies the chief's attack. Seeing this, the chief declares he will now break down Hans's body and use it as a test subject while firing yet another spell at him. Blocking this spell as well, Hans curses the chief for announcing the skill's name at the end and wishes for him to die already, calling him Alfred's enemy. Hearing the name Alfred, the chief asks if that's someone Hans knew in this village. Suddenly, a dark magic attack comes at the chief from behind, but he sees it just in time and deflects it, summoning a shield at the last moment. He realizes Hans is becoming abnormally accustomed to dark magic, likely due to the power of the fragment. Deciding not to waste any more time, he resolves to finish Hans off by raising his hand to use another dark spell. Meanwhile, at this time, the other dark mages in the village are busy battling the army of undead. Right then, one of the dark mages starts behaving strangely, prompting another to ask what is happening. Following this, one by one, every dark mage's soul begins to be drained away. The souls merge together, forming a crown which the chief places on top of his head. Seeing this, Hans asks the chief if he amplified his power at the cost of the other dark mage's souls. The chief bellows that Hans has survived due to the power of the fragment and declares that he will die now, beginning to utter the spell. However, before he can finish reciting the spell, a dark magic attack hurls at him, striking right near his heart. Hans, who just shot the spell, remarks that he almost fell asleep listening to the skill name, so he decided to finish it. Leaning closer to the chief, Hans thanks him for teaching him dark magic so well. The chief groans as he starts to bleed from the mouth, unable to believe he is dying like this. Finally, he falls to the ground, dead. Looking up at the sky, Hans asks if the rat is watching, as his revenge is now complete. He then wishes Alfred the rat to rest in peace. Meanwhile, a large palace of some kind sits peacefully under the bright light of the moon. Inside the palace, in a hall, someone is kneeling before a large statue, apparently praying. It's a lady, and she has her hands joined as she prays. After a while, she goes to see Bishop Martin and informs him that she's finished the prayer. She is the saint. Her name is Restar, and she asks the bishop if he can go and contact the others. Restar tells the bishop that she has detected a sign of the immortal king resurrecting from the west, which seems to take the bishop aback. Turning around, the bishop agrees to convene a meeting immediately and walks away. The immortal king is the one who plunged the continent into fear hundreds of years ago, but this time, Restar is prepared, and she won't let anything like that happen again. Walking across the aftermath of the battle, Hans notes that the damage done is significant, as almost every undead has been wiped out. However, this isn't a problem for him, as he is a necromancer and can replenish his troops, no matter how many die. Looking at his missing arm, Hans decides to take care of it first. He scans everywhere, trying to find the best fit for his arm. Luckily, he notices what he is looking for and snaps the arm from an undead soldier, thinking it will be a good fit. Using the super recovery trait, he easily reattaches the arm onto his shoulder. With his arm restored, Hans decides to start replenishing his troops for now. Lifting his head, he begins channeling the dark mana and starts resurrecting the undead. The dark mana released by Hans possesses a dead undead and lifts it off the ground. With his hand still raised, Hans continues directing the dark mana from the fragment of the immortal king into the undead. He reaches the final step of the resurrection and releases even more dark mana. However, instead of coming back to life, the undead's body gets destroyed. Seeing this, Hans becomes disappointed, realizing his trick isn't working. However, after several more tries, Hans manages to resurrect the undead and begins to get the hang of it. Next, he turns to the dead body of the chief lying behind him. He plans to turn the chief into an undead with a soul so he can try to extract information from him. While performing the resurrection, Hans realizes that the old chief doesn't have any soul. Upon closer inspection, he notices a magic circle inscribed on the chief's heart. Realizing his soul must have been extracted previously as a security measure. Hans thinks this is expected since such a large operation was being carried out. Security measures make sense. Regardless, Hans still decides to turn the chief into a top-tier undead with self-awareness and good fighting skills. Raising his hand at the chief's body, Hans channels dark mana into it, causing the corpse to lift off the ground. He ensures to keep the chief's thoughts and ego in his characteristics, just as they were before he was alive. Finally resurrected as an undead, the chief greets Hans and asks for orders. Hans is happy to see the undead chief speaking and gives him his previous name, Malcolm, instructing him to obey his words. When Malcolm does not respond, Hans smacks him hard on the head. Realizing that Malcolm doesn't have any memories of his past, Hans decides to harass Malcolm and make him pay for his previous crimes. Calling out to Malcolm, who nervously responds to his name being called, Hans points at the cane held by Malcolm, saying it looks nice. In this way, Hans takes the cane from Malcolm. Hans then notices the undead zombie who had attacked Jeffy, lying among the pile of other killed undead. Raising his hand at the pile, Hans wishes every undead to rest in peace as he sets all the undead on fire. Meanwhile, back on Earth in his room, Han Song-hyun looks super pleased, exclaiming that the food he ate was delicious. Taking out his phone, he decides to check the current price of gold. Back in the other world, Hans had found a place filled with plenty of gold, so Han Song-hyun plans to sell it. Raising his hand, he summons Hans. Instantly, Hans teleports into the room right before Han Song-hyun, releasing a powerful aura that startles him. Seeing the look on Hans's face, Han Song-hyun begins sweating in fear and hurriedly cancels the summon. As Hans disappears, Han Song-hyun breathes heavily, claiming he thought he would die from the pressure of the aura. Unsure of what to do now, Han Song-hyun thinks he should strengthen his unique skill first, so he calls out to the karma shop. He sees that he has earned more karma and now has around 700k, so he clicks on unique skill strengthen, costing 300k karma. The system informs Han Song-hyun that as his unique skill grows, the number of avatars he can have increases. The system also notifies him that his mental strength has exceeded the standard, granting him a new skill, Serenity, which can protect him from mental attacks. With this new skill, Han Song-hyun summons Hans back and begins collecting the gold. Unlike before, he feels no difference standing beside Hans. Han Song-hyun is surprised that he keeps acquiring new skills just like that. After collecting all the gold into a bag, Han Song-hyun decides to go sell it. Arriving at the jewelry store, he places the bag of treasures before the sellers, who are in awe at the sight of so much treasure. Telling the sellers to deposit all the money into his account, Han Song-hyun turns to leave the shop. On his way out, he claims to have Hans hidden in his shadow using dark magic in case of emergencies. Not only that, Han Song-hyun has also put a mask on Hans to be prepared for when he needs to summon him. However, since nothing has happened, he thinks he worried for nothing, when suddenly, the jewelry store explodes. A large wolf-like monster and a masked man are the thieves who just robbed the jewelry, with the wolf-man exclaiming they've hit the jackpot. He excitedly notes they never expected to find so much gold, while the masked man tells the wolf-man to shut up and run. The man climbs onto the wolf-man's back, and the wolf-man begins fleeing away. Han Song-hyun looks up at the thieves in horror as someone's plea for help fills the air. These thieves are commonly known as villains, who commit crimes using their awakened powers. There are also guardians, who use their awakened powers to help the citizens. Suddenly, Han Song-hyun gets a vision of 2 years ago when an explosion caused him to injure his legs. In the present, the wolfman punches Han Song-hyun hard in the face to push him out of the way. Clutching his cheek in pain, Han Song-hyun doesn't act, hoping the guardians will track down these villains. Despite having powers now, Han Song-hyun freezes in fear, unable to do anything. Meanwhile, the villains continue to flee, pleased that everything is going according to their plan. The masked man says they need to join Portal and escape, while the wolfman notes that she is waiting for them nearby. However, when the two reach Portal, they find her lying unconscious on the ground. The wolfman kneels by Portal and tries to wake her up, while the masked man notices a skeleton nearby and tells the wolfman to look over there. Seeing the undead, the wolfman asks if it is a guardian, while the masked man points out that it's not a guardian. Han Song-hyun may be too afraid to act, but Hans is not like that. He can do everything. 3 personnel rush hurriedly towards a nearby alley. These 3 are the guardians, pursuing the wolfman and the masked man. Upon arriving, the guardians are shocked to find all 3 villains defeated and passed out. Realizing this, they deduce that someone must have fought these villains and then vanished. Since it hasn't been long, the head of the guardians orders the others to search everywhere. Silently and stealthily, Hans returns to his shadow form and slithers away. Returning to Han Song-hyun, Hans hides back into his shadow. Stretching his arms with a smile, Han Song-hyun exclaims that it feels refreshing. On his way back to his apartment, he thinks relieving stress by beating up villains might be a good idea. Meanwhile, in the other world, Heinz, Han Song-hyun's second avatar, is pleased with something he sees. Standing at the gate of a town, he happily exclaims that he has finally arrived. Following the chief's instructions, Heinz realizes the chief didn't lie after all. Humming merrily, Heinz enters the town through the gate, looking forward to adventures in this world. However, upon entering, he finds the town completely empty, with no one in sight. Discovering that the townsfolk do not conduct security checks nor show interest in foreigners, Heinz finds it kind of boring. While walking along the street, he sees tough-looking men threatening a girl who is begging for more time. The bald man warns the girl to pay back 2 silver coins in 3 days or they will have no choice. Seeing this, Heinz assumes those men are thugs and that the girl might be exploited, so he decides to stay out of it. The girl accidentally collides with Heinz, letting out a painful groan. She bows down and apologizes to him. Heinz asks the girl if she knows this town, hoping she can guide him. Looking puzzled, the girl asks Heinz who he is. Taking out 2 silver coins, Heinz declares he is the girl's soon-to-be employer. He then asks if they should discuss the working conditions. As night falls, the girl takes Heinz to accommodations where he can stay. The girl's name is Diana. She explains that she is earning money to care for her little sibling after their parents died. Diana tells Heinz that the thugs were threatening her for not paying them back, as Heinz pays her the 2 silver coins and tells her to come to him the next morning as a guide. Lying on his back in bed, Heinz thinks he is doing a good deed helping Diana, even if he is getting ripped off. Feeling tired, he decides to sleep now. He wakes up early in the morning, unable to sleep more due to the uncomfortable bed. Hearing someone sneeze outside, Heinz gets out of bed and heads to the window. Looking out, he sees Diana is already waiting for him. Seeing Heinz, Diana happily greets him while he asks why she is there at dawn. After buying breakfast for Diana, Heinz tells her not to wait for him so early in the morning and to come during lunchtime instead. Gulping down her food ravenously, Diana says she understands and calls Heinz a juicy. She points to the remaining food on Heinz's plate, asking if he will eat it, and he tells her to eat if she is hungry. Thanking Heinz happily, Diana takes the loaf of bread and places it in her bag. From what Heinz has learned, this town is named Azanthu, a small town in the western part of the Talia kingdom. Placing his hand on the wall, Heinz notes that while this town looks like an ordinary medieval town, it has a particular symbol written all over it. Analyzing the symbol closely, Heinz points out that it's not paint, and Diana confirms it is blood. Heinz, who knew this, pretends to be ignorant and says he didn't know. Diana reveals that Heinz ate soup with venison yesterday, which startles him as he asks how she knew. Pointing to her nose, Diana claims she has a good sense of smell. As they continue their tour, Heinz asks about the symbol, and Diana explains that it's the emblem of an organization called Varkalak that oversees the road. While explaining this, Diana stops, causing Heinz to bump into her. Heinz asks what's wrong, and Diana claims she can smell something. Curious, Heinz asks about the smell, and Diana enthusiastically says she can smell the scent of freshly baked bread and suggests Heinz try it. Heinz reminds Diana that she just ate a moment ago, but she insists she can eat everything. From a dark alley somewhere, an unusual scent is wafting into the town. The scent appears to come from a corpse inside a house. A few days later, Heinz is waiting for Diana, leaning against the wall and noting she has never been late before. At that moment, the bald man calls out to Heinz. The bald man and his friend stand before Heinz, claiming they need to talk. Heinz takes out a handful of silver coins and offers them to the thugs, saying it's for them to maintain public order, pleasing them. Noticing the symbol he saw on the wall tattooed on the bald man's neck, Heinz recalls Diana warning him against lurking in the back alleys. He wonders what these thugs did to make Diana so scared. As they walk away, the man with hair asks the bald man why they captured the kid, and the bald man replies he doesn't know and just did what he was told. Hearing this, Heinz gets on guard, wondering if the kid refers to Diana. He then shouts after the thugs, telling them to stop. Deciding to act now, Heinz prepares to face the thugs, thinking that if things go out of control, he can just cancel the summon and return to Earth. He tells the thugs he's curious about something. However, at that moment, Diana arrives there and calls out to Heinz. Cracking his knuckles, the bald man asks Heinz what he is curious about. Seeing that Diana is safe, Heinz quickly comes up with an excuse, claiming he was curious if the silver coins he gave would be enough. With his pouch empty after giving away every coin he had to the thugs, Heinz gets angry and asks Diana why she was late, declaring she won't get food today. With fear in her eyes, Diana tells him that her little brother has disappeared. Tears streaming down her face, she explains that her brother got healthy recently eating the food Heinz provided, but now he's nowhere to be found. Heinz wonders if the little kid the thugs mentioned is actually Diana's brother. He asks Diana if there's a chance those thugs could have captured her brother, mentioning he overheard them talking about kidnapping a little kid. Upon hearing this, Diana begins to cry loudly, and Heinz, taken aback, assures her not to worry, promising to pay any ransom to free her brother. Now crying even louder, Diana wails that if those men took her brother, they would kill him, as they want blood, not money. Startled by this, Heinz asks why they want blood, and Diana reveals that this town is a food storage for vampires. Standing on a rooftop and looking down at the undead lying dead on the ground, a vampire rejoices at the smell of dark manna in the air. The vampire wonders if there was an internal conflict because of the fragment of the immortal king, claiming he was planning to take it away once it matured. Flexing his pointed fangs, the vampire states that although he doesn't know who possesses the fragment, he knows where it's headed and declares he will catch them very soon. Heinz asks if Diana really means vampires, and she confirms, revealing that all organizations, including Varkalak, are run by vampires. Wiping the tears running down her cheeks, Diana states that anyone who has managed to escape the city ends up dying. Still crying, Diana claims she and her brother were doing just fine, trying their best every day. Sitting on her knees, she sobs that in the end, she and her brother are going to get eaten. After listening to all this, Heinz grabs Diana's head, shouting at her to snap out of it. He tells her that if what she is saying is true, then they don't have much time and asks if she knows where her brother could have been taken. Not believing Heinz's words, Diana asks him if he will really help her. She reminds him that it's impossible to go against the vampires, but Heinz smiles and assures Diana not to worry. He tells Diana that he is an expert at giving bad bastards a hard time. That evening in the Traven, the thugs from before are gambling, playing cards, where the Baldy says he robbed someone outside to get this much money. Right at that moment, Heinz kicks the door to the Traven open and walks in. The thugs turn to face Heinz while the dude in the blue shirt stands up. Recognizing Heinz, the thug laughs and mocks him, asking if he's the one they robbed outside and if he came to donate again. The thugs continue making fun of Heinz, asking how he got in when there were guards outside, unaware that Heinz has already beaten the crap out of those guards. Heinz speaks in a serious tone, telling the thugs to tell him where they took the kid they mentioned earlier. Looking angry, the thug threateningly points at Heinz, asking if he knows who he is messing with, not aware of the knife Heinz is hiding behind his back. Without warning, Heinz attacks the thug with the knife. Heinz states that he knows what scum these thugs are, people who mess with other families for money. He shouts out, calling the thugs trash. With one thug down, there are two thugs inside that Heinz needs to take care of now. The two thugs see their partner killed and both withdraw their own weapons, asking Heinz what he is doing. Having the durability and super recovery skills, Heinz is confident he can do this as he charges at the remaining thugs. He swings his knife at the bald thug, who dodges it. Meanwhile, the other thug takes the chance and strikes Heinz with his own dagger. However, the dagger doesn't even scratch Heinz and only cuts his jacket, bewildering the thug. Heinz quickly counterattacks and kills that thug as well. As the thug falls dead to the ground, Heinz reveals that he is wearing a stab-proof vest. The Baldy raises his axe, preparing to attack Heinz from behind, but Heinz is too quick. He turns around and summons a magic barrier, deflecting the Baldy's attack. The Baldy is baffled, seeing that Heinz can use magic too, and before he can ask how Heinz has magic tools, he also gets killed. Heinz is relieved that he brought some magic tools with him that came in handy just now. Now with all the thugs dead, Heinz takes a sigh of relief, glad it's all over. However, it's not over, as half a dozen more thugs come down the stairs upon hearing the commotion. Noticing Heinz, the thugs quickly charge at him as Heinz curses himself for getting into this trouble. The fight rages on, and Heinz fights with everything he's got, taking down the thugs one by one. After a few minutes, Heinz gets exhausted and sustains a lot of injuries but manages to take down everyone. Pulling the knife that pierced him, he notes that he lost count while fighting. As his injury begins to heal fast, he calls out to a thug he kept alive. Placing his foot on the thug's head, Heinz asks him where they took the boy they captured, but the thug refuses to answer. The thug says that Heinz looks like an outsider and warns him that he will regret doing all this. He claims that his boss will be arriving here soon, and when he does, Heinz will meet his end. Thanking the thug for the information, Heinz finishes him off too, telling him to worry about his own life. With some effort, Heinz manages to locate Diana's brother Aaron, locked in a room. Seeing Heinz there, Aaron starts trembling in fear and begs to be spared. Kneeling before Aaron, Heinz tries to calm him down, telling him his sister sent him to save him. Aaron asks Heinz if he really knows his sister, and Heinz affirms it, offering to explain everything when they leave. Just as a vampire in bat form flies toward the house, the vampire lands on the window and hears Heinz talking about getting out of there. Taking his form back to human, the vampire asks Heinz who he is daring to take his food out of his restaurant. The vampire says he will be eating the kid and asks Heinz if he is from the Vow of Defiance, while Heinz turns around in alarm. The vampire asks Heinz if he knows what happens to those who defy him. Grinning, Heinz says he's just someone whom the thugs robbed and he is here to help the kid. Raising his hand, the vampire says it's boring and claims he prefers boys as his meal. He then shoots a blood-type attack at Heinz, releasing streams of blood from his palm. Heinz shouts at Aaron to run and places himself before Aaron to shield him from the blood. The blood attack causes the whole floor to collapse, sending Heinz and Aaron crashing down to the lower floor. Getting up, Heinz shakes Aaron, asking if he's hurt and if he's okay. As they are near the door, Heinz tells Aaron to hurry and run outside as the vampire also lands down, noting that Heinz just dodged his attack. Flexing his sharp claws, the vampire admits Heinz is faster than he thought, and he charges at Heinz, stating that killing him will be a nice warm-up. Heinz raises his sword before him and gets into defense while pushing Aaron out of the way, telling him to run. The vampire swings his arm at Heinz, who blocks it with his sword. The nails on the vampire's hand now grow tenfold as he swings his arm at Heinz. Unable to dodge the attack, Heinz gets pierced by the sharp nails of the vampire. With his nails still piercing Heinz's chest, the vampire acknowledges that Heinz's strength and recovery ability are quite impressive. Licking his lips, the vampire notes that although he didn't plan to eat Heinz, it will now be quite a delicacy. Not wanting to just sit and do nothing, Heinz clenches his fingers into a fist. The vampire notices this, and before Heinz can make a move, his hand gets severed from his arm. Heinz lets out a loud groan of pain as the vampire declares Heinz's meaningless resistance will end now. Opening his mouth and revealing his fangs, the vampire gets ready to suck Heinz's blood as a price for defying him. Heinz, who has a magic item in his mouth, begins to crush it, ready to die and take the vampire along with him. Suddenly, Heinz's body becomes engulfed in fire, which spreads wide. Taken aback by the sudden burst of fire, the vampire asks Heinz if he had planned this fire all along. Heinz reveals that when he was slammed to the ground earlier, he saw the alcohol spread across the floor and got an idea. Right then, he had planned to use the alcohol and the magic tool he has to turn the situation around. Now realizing he can't win, Heinz lights himself on fire, intending to take the vampire with him and burn the whole place to the ground. The vampire tries to distance himself from Heinz and pushes him off. Thinking he's free, the vampire smiles, calling Heinz a fragile piece of flesh. But to his horror, Heinz lunges at him and headbutts him with force. The vampire gets slammed onto the ground, and Heinz takes the chance to lunge at the vampire. Shouting out loud, Heinz jumps on top of the vampire, who screams in fear. Drowning the vampire's scream, the restaurant explodes, releasing tremendous fire everywhere. The fire spreads everywhere, engulfing the entire restaurant within seconds and setting it ablaze. Inside, Heinz finds it impressive that, despite being on fire, he is still alive. In such a dire situation, Heinz admits that being too strong can be a problem as well. However, the more important matter is the mission he assigned himself, to save the unfortunate girl. The mission is successful, and Diana is reunited with her brother as they shout for Heinz outside the restaurant. Han Sung-hyun receives notification that Heinz has died and will respawn in 7 days. Meanwhile, Diana has started a new job polishing shoes and makes a living from it. Having worked hard, Diana wipes the sweat from her forehead when a customer walks by, asking to have his shoes polished. With a happy expression, Diana turns around and tells the customer to take a seat. Just then, her eyes fall on the customer's face, and she realizes it's Heinz. She happily jumps into his arms and hugs him. Patting Diana's head, Heinz smiles back, assuring her that he is safe and not someone who would fall easily. However, this is a lie, as Heinz actually died in the fire. It would take a whole week for Heinz to respawn, which would worry Diana. To prevent that, Han Sung-hyun had decided to operate a new character until Heinz respawns. This new character is also named Heinz. Han Sung-hyun then sent this avatar into the world as soon as possible, ensuring Diana never learns the real Heinz has died. Han Sung-hyun was certain that Diana would believe the new avatar is really Heinz. This is because the soul's essence remains the same as it was in the previous Heinz. Looking worried, Diana tells Heinz he can't stay here anymore, as the vampires are searching for him. Giving a reassuring smile, Heinz assures Diana not to worry, claiming he has figured everything out. With the immortal king Hans on his side, Heinz feels no fear of the vampires. Later that day, Heinz is in his room, reviewing the system and noting he must wait 10 days for the interdimensional transmission. While he is focused on this, a bat, possibly another vampire, flies toward the window behind him. Suddenly, the window blasts open, and the vampire grabs Heinz's neck from behind, taking him by surprise. Forcing Heinz to the wall, the vampire demands to know if he did it. Still gripping Heinz's neck, the vampire states that the traces leading to him are clear. With a smirk, the vampire questions how an outsider can remain under the jurisdiction of their slain vampire. Choked and unable to muster any strength, Heinz realizes this vampire is too powerful. The vampire notes he cannot sense the aura of dark magic nor smell the blood of his kin. Hearing this, Heinz asks what the vampire means, claiming he does not understand what is happening. With a grin, the vampire asks if Heinz truly does not understand the situation. Biting hard into Heinz's neck, the vampire confirms if he really does not understand. Releasing the bite, the vampire licks his lips and states he will ask again slowly. He also claims that Heinz will be unable to lie anymore. Suddenly, Heinz begins transforming into a vampire after receiving the bite. The vampire then notes that he will question Heinz again. Heinz gains a special skill called Bloodline, Lesser Blood, and his previous skill Super Recovery changes to Regeneration. The vampire exerts an authority akin to powerful pressure, asking Heinz if he is truly unrelated to the vow of defiance. Heinz feels his body scream to submit to the higher vampire and affirms that he is just a traveler. However, Heinz grins, knowing he can choose to ignore the vampire if he wants. The Mind Hub skill acts as a filter, sifting through the instinct of submission in Heinz's blood. The vampire finally confirms that Heinz is not his enemy and turns to leave, instructing Heinz to follow him. Heinz decides to follow the vampire to gather information. The vampire takes Heinz to one of the branches of the Varkoslak clan, where the other vampires bow and greet him as Lord Wyrak. Noticing Heinz following Wyrak, the other vampires begin whispering, wondering if Heinz is Wyrak's new lesser blood. Suddenly, a female vampire grabs Heinz's arm from behind, exclaiming happily that a new lesser blood has come after so long. She introduces herself as Rosilika and asks for Heinz's name. Heinz introduces himself, and Rosilika offers him a glass of drink, claiming she is also a lesser blood like him. Smiling wide, Rosilika informs Heinz that the drink is freshly squeezed blood and encourages him to drink. Not wanting to arouse suspicion, Heinz quietly drinks. The moment the blood touches his lips, he feels a strong bloodlust, despite the Mind Hub filtering his body. Therefore, he decides to block the taste and smell before drinking the blood. Draining the cup, Heinz wipes his mouth and lies that the blood was good. Rosilika teases Heinz, saying if he were human, she would suck him dry. Laughing nervously, Heinz asks what lesser blood means. Hearing this question, Rosilika asks if Heinz knows anything about vampires at all. She then explains that lesser blood is like the knight rank among humans, while purebloods like Lord Wyrak are nobility. On the other hand, the clan leaders, known as true blood, are royalty, and there's saint blood, which represents a kind of faith. Heinz asks what faith means, and Rosilika notes that it refers to their progenitor, the one they must absolutely obey. At that moment, Lord Wyrak walks onto the veranda of the second floor and looks down at the hall, gathering the attention of all the vampires. With everyone gathered, Lord Wyrak suggests they get to the point. He informs the vampires present that the fragments of the immortal king that the vow of defiance had are missing. He explains that it has been confirmed the fragment was last headed toward the city before vanishing without a trace, indicating it may have already entered the city. Hearing about the fragments, Heinz is taken aback, while Rosilika asks if he doesn't know about them. She tells Heinz about a group of dark mages in a nearby village cultivating the fragments of the immortal king, and Heinz is shocked to learn those individuals were the vow of defiance. Lord Wyrak then assigns all the vampires to different areas to search and report back. After the meeting concludes, Heinz and Rosilika begin their journey back. On the way, Rosilika holds an umbrella over her head to shield herself from the sun. Without an umbrella, Heinz covers his head with cloth, explaining that exposure to sunlight makes him feel weak. Rosilika sighs, noting that it is surprising the fragments have disappeared, and that moving their fragments here was a waste of effort. Hearing this, Heinz asks Rosilika what she means by our fragments, questioning if there are more fragments of the immortal king in this town. Rosilika confirms this and explains that the dark mages said they would fuse the cultivated fragments with those already present in the town. Realizing this, Heinz thinks he got lucky, assuming that Lord Wyrak must be guarding the remaining fragments here. to ensure his theory is correct, he steps in front of Rosilica and impatiently asks if she knows the location of the fragments. Laughing, Rosilica replies that someone like her would never know such information. Later that day, upon hearing Heinz is curious about the fragments, Diana says she might know something. Puzzled, Heinz asks what she knows, and Diana replies that she knows where the fragments of the immortal king are. Hearing this, Heinz shouts in shock, completely baffled and surprised. Unable to believe it, Heinz asks Diana if she really knows where the fragments of the immortal king are. Diana, sitting on the other side of the table during dinner, confirms that she knows. She then explains that about a year ago, she used to work on cleaning the tomb. During that time, every Friday, some members of the Varkalak organization would visit the stone chamber. Each time they opened the stone chamber, a terrible and evil smell would escape. Hearing this, Heinz thinks it is definitely worth investigating. Standing up, he thanks Diana for the valuable information and says he will go investigate it, telling the siblings to stay hidden in the meantime. As Heinz is about to leave, Diana grabs his hand to stop him. She leans closer to Heinz and notes that his smell is a bit different. Aware that Diana's nose can't be fooled, Heinz reveals the truth and shows her his fangs. Seeing this, Diana is shocked, but Heinz assures her he won't do her any harm. With a serious tone, Diana says that if it gets tough for Heinz, she gives him permission to drink a little of her blood. Her arm raised at Heinz, she begins to tremble and, with eyes closed, tells him not to overdo it and just drink a little of her blood. Giving a gentle smack on Diana's head, Heinz tells her to stop running her mouth. He then asks Diana for the exact location of the tomb. Meanwhile, at the tomb, a scream from someone shakes the air. Inside, a vampire's voice instructs the screaming person to get up and stand straight. The vampire asks the injured man if he wants to just die without fighting. Lifting a single finger, the vampire says that if the man can swing his sword at him even once, he will be allowed to leave safely. Hearing this offer, the man lifts the sword with both hands, though fear is evident on his face. Screaming out loud, the man charges straight at the vampire, raising his sword. The vampire pulls back a punch, causing blood to swirl around his arm, and releases his hand forward, causing blood strings to fly toward the man and entangle him. The blood strings slam the man against the wall. He is unable to move as the blood strings begin piercing his body, and within a second, all the blood from his body gets sucked out, leaving him like a corpse. The vampire clicks his tongue and complains that it's all boring. He tells the worker there to clean up the mess and bring a sturdier one for the next sacrifice. The worker agrees and goes to clean the place up. While the worker is cleaning, he sees something and cautiously questions who's there. Suddenly half a dozen undead charge forward at the worker, taking him by surprise. After finishing him off, the undead then charge at the vampire, who is equally shocked to see them. He commands the other servants to attack the undead and get rid of them. As the undead charge at the vampire, dark mana begins to build up. The mana then turns into large spikes that hurl out of the ground right where the vampire is standing. Pierced by the spikes, the vampire asks who is doing this and if it is a necromancer from the Vow of Defiance. The vampire questions the undead about how they knew about this place, but Hans keeps silent and doesn't answer. The vampire notes that Hans won't speak willingly and claims he doesn't care. He declares that he'll ask again after he leaves Hans's only head behind. Then he swings his hand before him, destroying the undead charging at him. The upper half of one of the undead separates from its lower half and flies into the air. Hearing the vampire speak about leaving only his head, Hans uses a dark spell, causing sharp bones to develop around the undead. Hans then unleashes attacks on the vampire, sending all the spiked undead flying at him while summoning undead arms right under the vampire's feet. Meanwhile, a fierce battle between the undead and vampires rages outside as one servant informs that reinforcements are on their way. Hearing this, the vampire notes that it's good and tells the others to continue supporting him. Just as Heinz arrives behind him, the vampire continues instructing his servants to stall for time until reinforcements arrive but suddenly stops, feeling blood trickling down his face. For a moment, he is puzzled, as it appears Heinz has bitten him from behind. Now realizing what's happening, the vampire panics and asks Heinz if he has lost his mind. Just then, dark mana wraps around the vampire's hands, making him unable to attack, as he recognizes it as dark magic. The vampire becomes terrified and begins sweating, shouting for Hans and Heinz to stop. As his face drains of blood, he shouts that drinking the blood of your own kind is the biggest sin. After a few seconds, the vampire's entire body is drained of blood, leaving him a corpse as Heinz releases him. Wiping his mouth, Heinz points out that the mind-tainting trick the vampire tried on him doesn't work. Just then, he acquires a new skill called blood magic. With this new ability, Heinz raises his hand at the blood barrier before him, confident he can break it, but Hans notes they don't have enough time. If that's the case, Heinz decides to smash the barrier. Suddenly, a large explosion blows the roof of the structure apart, shaking the whole ground. Looking down into the tomb, Heinz and Hans exchange excited looks as they find what they were looking for. It's the second fragment of the Immortal King. Hans raises his hand and extends it toward the fragment to grab it. The moment he touches it, an overwhelming amount of negative energy is released into the surroundings. Even with Mind Hub filtering negative thoughts, Hans begins to feel despair. To overcome this, Han Song-hyun directs all the clones' mental power to focus on Hans, shielding his mind from negative thoughts. The dark mana bellows upward into the sky, sending shockwaves in all directions, causing the vampires outside to shield their faces. Lord Wyrak, who just arrived, stares up into the sky in terror, realizing he is too late. From the hole in the roof, Hans rises into the sky, his eyes glowing blue with mana. Spotting him, the vampires begin shooting blood attacks at him. The attacks hit Hans but have no effect, only enraging him further as he prepares to use a spell. Swinging his arm, Hans instantly finishes off a vampire who lets out a scream before dying. Seeing the ominous figure of Hans, Lord Wyrak seems to realize something, as if recognizing him from somewhere. The skill regeneration that Hans had before evolves into the special skill Immortality. Hans also acquires the special skills Forbidden Knowledge and Archlit. The dark mana surges into the sky, towering so high that it becomes visible to two soldiers from a distance. The soldier on foot points out with urgency that the dark mana has erupted near the city of Azanthu. Suddenly, he begins to cough violently as the dark mana pollutes the air around him. The knight on horseback, alarmed by the sight, decides to return to the cathedral to report to the Saints. Gazing at the sky, the knight remarks that the fragmented dark mana is no ordinary occurrence, it signifies the resurrection of the Immortal King. Meanwhile, Wyrak is shielding his face with one arm, marveling at how the mana's strength has increased tenfold in mere seconds. Hans, now transformed into an Archlich, descends to the ground with new powers, including the ability to endlessly resurrect. Equipped with evil wisdom and forbidden knowledge traits, Hans now wields an unparalleled mastery of dark magic. With a single finger raised, Hans unleashes a smoky substance that engulfs Wyrak and the other vampire. Stunned by the sudden attack, Wyrak is left bewildered, unable to grasp Hans's intentions. The other vampire suggests they retreat and regroup elsewhere, but before he can act, a dark hand grabs him from behind and yanks him away. With his subordinate gone, Wyrak is overcome with terror, which escalates as dark mana spikes pierce through his body, eliciting a guttural groan of pain. Immobilized and impaled by the spikes, Wyrak's agonized screams fill the air as Hans approaches him menacingly. Hans acknowledges Wyrak's strength, but dismissively calls him nothing more than a mere bloodbag. Struggling to comprehend Hans's newfound power, Wyrak questions whether Hans fully absorbed the fragment. At that moment, Heinz lunges at Wyrak from behind, his fangs bared and ready to strike. With a pained scream, Wyrak collapses as Heinz smashes him to the ground. The system announces that Heinz has fulfilled the conditions for his special skill, Bloodline Lesser Blood, to evolve into Bloodline Pure Blood. Thrilled by his evolution into a pure blood, Heinz realizes that devouring other vampires will make him even stronger. While this unfolds, the remaining vampires have gathered in a distant forest, mourning their defeat after losing their Lord Wyrak. Among them, Rosilica weeps bitterly, lamenting to Lady Parita that had Parita been present earlier, the vampires wouldn't have fallen so easily. Lady Parita observes the overwhelming dark mana lingering in the air and notes the unmatched strength of their enemy. As dawn approaches, Lady Parita urges the group to retreat to their main base and await reinforcements. Meanwhile, in the city, a man sprints through the streets, gasping for breath and screaming as if fleeing from death itself. He pauses in an alley, curses his pursuer, and hopes he has finally evaded them. However, he is startled when Hans suddenly grabs his arm from behind, swiftly ending his life. After the battle, Hans remains in the city to eradicate the Varkalak remnants, while Heinz arranges for a small merchant group to escort the Diana siblings to safety. Resting now, Heinz takes charge of preparing a meal, showcasing his culinary skills. He serves steak to the siblings, who eagerly accept, their mouths watering at the aroma of the food. As they take their first bites, they thank Heinz warmly, who smiles and encourages them to eat to their heart's content. The siblings seem visibly happier, and Heinz notes they must feel relieved to have escaped the dangers of the city. Heinz asks if their uncle owns a shop in eastern Lapilas, and Diana confirms with a nod. However, Diana confesses with a nervous smile that she isn't sure whether their uncle will welcome them. Heinz decides he will provide the siblings with financial support if their uncle refuses to take them in. Growing attached to the siblings, Heinz feels an unfamiliar wave of emotion as he prepares to leave them behind. Sensing the change in Heinz's demeanor, Diana asks if he's okay or if he's low on blood flow. Laughing heartily, Heinz assures her he's fine, having already devoured the vampires from their previous village. Meanwhile, Hans is occupied with converting vampires into his undead servants and storing them within his system's subspace. Using the immense energy from his traits, Hans wonders if he can eventually open a subspace on Earth through further research. As Hans becomes lost in thought, a vampire suddenly appears above him, poised to attack. The vampire launches a swirl of blood magic that pierces through Hans, striking him cleanly. The attacker, introducing himself as Ovor Varkoslak, a true-blood vampire, demands to know why Hans remains in the vampire city. Varkoslak has returned with reinforcements to end Hans and accuses him of being part of the Vow of Defiance. Gripping the blood spear lodged in his chest, Hans defiantly confirms his allegiance to the Vow of Defiance. Varkoslak counters, claiming the Vow's hideout has already been destroyed, leaving no room for deception. Summoning a scythe made of blood, Varkoslak smirks and charges at Hans, vowing to kill him. Swinging the scythe with lethal precision, Varkoslak manages to slice Hans in half. To his astonishment, Hans instantly regenerates, his new abilities allowing him to recover as if nothing happened. Acknowledging Varkoslak's strength, Hans realizes that defeating a trueblood will not be an easy task. Attempting to retreat, Hans crashes into a blood barrier that traps him with no escape. The vampire mages have conjured the barrier, ensuring Hans cannot flee from Varkoslak. Testing its strength, Hans concludes he can break the barrier but needs more time to master his new powers. The mages unleash enormous blood claws that fly toward Hans, aiming to tear him apart. Realizing his disadvantage, Hans decides to retreat but vows to meet Varkoslak again in the future. Han Song-hyun cancels the summon and prepares to teleport Hans out of this world. With a burst of dark magic, Hans vanishes into thin air, leaving Varkoslak and the others dumbfounded. Stunned, Varkoslak demands to know how Hans escaped the blood barrier. Suddenly, a vampire scout falls from above, an arrow embedded in his back. Varkoslak recognizes the arrow as belonging to the Holy Paladins. Another scout points out that the Paladin Order of the Church of the Supreme God has surrounded the tomb. Realizing he's been outmaneuvered, Varkoslak curses and clenches his fists in frustration. Meanwhile, Hans reappears in Han Song-hyun's room, receiving a thumbs up for his survival. Hans confidently states that he is the very embodiment of death, the Vow of Defiance, his tone oozing with ominous authority. Hearing Hans's words, Han Song-hyun leaps onto his bed, writhing as fear tangles and spreads through him. Clutching his head tightly, Han Song-hyun casts a terrified look, regretting what made Hans say such words. Hans removes his head, holds it proudly, and smirks as he boasts about single-handedly defeating an evil vampire group to save a powerless girl and the entire city. At these remarks, Han Song-hyun breaks into a smile, claiming that such heroic acts make him feel like a hero. Getting to his feet and stretching his arms lazily, Han Song-hyun wonders aloud how many karma points he must have collected. With curiosity piqued, he summons the karma shop, but his reaction instantly shifts to shock. The screen displays an astonishing 700,000 karma points, an amount so high that it makes him question how he earned it all. He assumes that the discord he caused among the dark mages and vampires must have left a significant ripple effect. Thrilled by his incredible balance, Han Song-hyun decides to use the points to enhance his unique skill. Upon enhancement, the system notifies him that the number of avatars he can summon has increased. Additionally, the system reveals that he has acquired a brand new special skill known as Persona, which intrigues him deeply. He learns that Persona is an exceptional ability that allows an avatar to act as a vessel capable of containing a person's emotions. The system explains that his unique skill evolves to suit him, and Han Song-hyun concludes it must have recognized his need for Persona. Reflecting on his journey in the game, Han Song-hyun recalls how he built connections with strangers and helped others defeat powerful enemies. Before all this, Han Song-hyun had been locked in his room for 2 years, and he realizes treating it like a game is what drives him forward. If it were about reality, Han Song-hyun admits he is still just a recluse, with the harsh truths he has avoided now staring him directly in the face. Mustering courage, Han Song-hyun gathers all the loneliness, sadness, and anger he has suppressed and transfers those stagnant, rotting feelings into Hans. After letting go of those negative energies, Han Sung-hyun takes a deep breath, feeling refreshed. He wonders how Hans must feel now that he's burdened with all the negativity that was festering within him. Hans reassures Han Sung-hyun, saying pain and despair have always been his companions, so this is nothing new. Hearing Hans speak so naturally, Han Sung-hyun is taken aback, sensing Hans has developed his own emotions. Hans confirms that he is indeed an avatar filled with countless emotions, which is why he has grown his own personality over time. Han Sung-hyun is still bewildered when, out of nowhere, he hears a loud explosion behind him and turns his head in alarm. Looking out of the window, he spots smoke billowing into the sky and thinks that some villain must be attacking the city. Frustrated, he turns around and mutters that he doesn't care about the attack, leaving it to the Guardians, as he has no reason to fight. Confronting this statement, Hans asks Han Sung-hyun why he would need a reason to eradicate evil. Hearing Hans's words, Han Sung-hyun realizes that after transferring his negative emotions, Hans is now just reflecting his habitual avoidance. Deep down, Han Sung-hyun knows he desires to eliminate villains more than anything, but his lack of courage has kept him making excuses. Hans solemnly states that as chaos descends and the order of the world shakes, lawless people are rampaging everywhere, unchecked. Placing another mask over his already donned one, Hans declares with conviction that he will now become the law for evil people. Without hesitation, he takes off, forcing his way out through the building's rooftop as he soars into the dark, ominous sky. Meanwhile, at the crime scene, two Guardians discuss the recent villain attacks, noting the organized assaults across multiple locations. Overhearing this, Hans deduces that the villains must have formed some sort of faction to coordinate their chaos. To investigate, Hans summons two large, round eyeballs. The eyeballs snap open, and with a single command from Hans, they dart into the darkness. The eyes glide through alleys, meticulously scanning every shadowy corner. Somewhere in a dimly lit alley, two thugs have captured a helpless person and are holding him captive. One of the thugs lowers a burning cigarette toward the victim's skin when one of the eyeballs appears before them. Elsewhere, in a small house, a terrified mother cradles her child as a man approaches her menacingly, his belt raised to strike. Just as the man prepares to lash out, the second eyeball arrives there. In another part of the city, a thief breaks a window with a crowbar and sneaks into someone's room, oblivious. With a grin, the thief begins gathering valuables, entirely unaware of the eye behind him. Hans, controlling all the eyeballs, solemnly declares that he will punish everyone committing wrongs. Appearing before the masked thief, Hans grabs him by the throat, slamming him against the wall. Likewise, Hans materializes behind the abusive husband, locking his arm around the man's neck. He also appears before the bullies attempting to burn their victim and firmly grabs the thug's hand. Hans is like omnipresent, dealing with all three wrongdoers simultaneously, planting seeds of fear and darkness into their minds. Their blood-curdling screams echo through the silent night as they are overwhelmed by horrors. The real Hans clenches his fist, feeling himself grow more accustomed to the immense power he now wields. Fueled by a newfound purpose, he summons dozens of additional eyeballs around him, ready to continue his crusade. With arms extended, Hans releases the swarm of eyeballs, sending them flying toward the city to cleanse it of evil. Hans spends the night cleaning up the city, defeating criminals and delivering justice, feeling immensely satisfied. He finds the Eye of Darkness quite helpful but also quickly realizes its limitations. The limitation is that when the eyeballs are exposed to light, their power weakens and they eventually vanish. So, Hans thinks he should find other ways to carry out his plans that don't involve unleashing the undead into the city. Right then, a pigeon poops on his head, making him furious as he curses after them, wanting to make them his minions. A sudden idea strikes him that he can absolutely make the birds his minions and use them to scout the city from above. The word familiar refers to the enslavement magic used by dark magic masters to control animals, and Hans believes he can do this too. But Hans finds, after several attempts, that the enslavement magic isn't working for him as he hoped. He's turned the goblin den into his research lab, locking up cats and birds to enslave them, but it's harder than he expected. He's trying to perfect the animals as minions to blend in with human society, but it's not working. He gives it another try and channels his dark power into the cat. The cat develops 5 eyes and gains a significant strength boost, causing it to escape from the cage on its own. As the cat leaps away, Hans is disappointed, realizing that after 3 weeks of research, the results are still unsatisfactory. Now, there is only one last test subject left, and Hans is determined to succeed this time. He takes the bird out of its cage, struggling to hold it steady due to its constant flapping. Lifting the bird closer to his face, Hans uses the enslavement magic and breathes dark power at the bird. After a few seconds, the bird stops struggling, and Hans sighs in relief, thinking that it's finally done. Suddenly, the bird takes off from Hans's hands like a bullet, startling him. Fortunately, this time, the bird looks perfectly normal, just like any other bird as it flies towards a flock. Landing near the other birds, the enslaved bird begins grazing with them, as though it is one of their own. Witnessing this, Hans is relieved that the last attempt was a success, and now the infected entities are his eyes and ears across the city. After infecting more birds, Hans releases them in all directions, instructing them to find enemies for him. Meanwhile, a little away in the same forest, a paladin arrives behind a man kneeling on the ground, examining something. Peering into his hands, the man recalls the words Hans had uttered about him being the vow of defiance. The paladin calls out to Archbishop Lacius, who acknowledges his arrival, addressing him as Sir Tuscan. Sir Tuscan informs Lacius that after interrogating the remaining vampires, it's clear that they are not allies of the immortal king's descendants. Lacius says they need to find more clues before the immortal king can grow any stronger. Right then, a cross appears above his palm that begins ringing, signaling an incoming message. Joining both his hands, Lacius speaks to the Saintess, asking if she called him. The Saintess, back at the church, informs Lacius that the immortal king's presence has been detected in a cave in the northwest mountains. Thanking the Saintess, Lacius assures her that he won't fail her this time. Back in his cave, Hans is sitting cross-legged on the ground, waiting for news from any of his familiars he had sent to investigate. Suddenly, he feels a strange sensation, as if his familiars are running away from something. It feels as though the familiars are terrified, but if they had encountered any monsters, they should have informed Hans immediately. So this can only mean, as Hans believes, that the familiars have encountered humans. Turning to his feet abruptly, Hans wonders if the humans coming this far into such a remote area are preparing to ambush him. He realizes the humans have surrounded the entire cave now, closing in from all sides. An arrow flies up and strikes one of Hans's familiars who is scouting the humans, piercing it. Standing closer to the cave opening, Sir Tuscan shouts out to Hans, saying that his tricks won't work on them. Reaching for his sword, Tuscan tells Hans that he can't run from them anymore, and they'll deal with him once and for all. He pulls out his holy sword and points it directly at Hans, telling him to surrender. Noticing the cross on Tuscan's chest, Hans recognizes him as the paladin of the order, the same one he saw back at Varkoslak. Sweating a little, Hans asks Tuscan how they found his hideout. Suddenly, Tuscan charges at Hans, swinging his sword at him with deadly force. As Hans falls down to his knees, Tuscan points the sword at him with unwavering precision. Looking resilient, Tuscan tells Hans that his words won't deceive him in any way, and he won't be fooled by any of his tricks. Hans admits Tuscan is as stubborn and narrow-minded as he seems but decides to play along, quickly striking Tuscan while searching for an escape. The attack sends Tuscan flying backwards, slamming into the cave wall. Raising his left hand to produce a blinding holy light, Tuscan distracts Hans and plunges his sword into Hans's ribcage with his other hand. Hans asks Tuscan if he is accusing him of a crime simply for punishing the wicked, trying to justify his actions. Tuscan accuses Hans of becoming evil after gaining forbidden power, raising a clenched fist in anger. Preparing to counter the fist, Hans asks Tuscan what kind of twisted logic he is using to justify his actions. But Hans is unable to react in time, as Tuscan's fist lands on his face with such force that it sends him flying out of the cave. Hans crashes onto the ground near the cave, surrounded by half a dozen priests on the cliffs. The priests chant a melodious holy hymn, unleashing a powerful attack that causes Hans great discomfort and weakens him significantly. Although Hans could easily kill all these priests, he knows they are innocent. While Hans is distracted by the holy chant, Tuscan lunges at him from behind and plunges the sword deep into his chest. With Hans distracted, Tuscan shouts orders to the priests to restrain him and prevent him from escaping. All the priests raise 2 fingers together, summoning golden, bright chains that fly at Hans, piercing his body with unyielding force. Within seconds, Hans is completely bound by those holy chains from head to toe, and he is unable to break free. Hans realizes he let his guard down as the chains lift him into the air, rendering him immobile and unable to use magic. All these chains and the singing verses are crafted so well that Hans can't escape anywhere. Hans tells Tuscan that he did put in a lot of effort to catch him, and Tuscan responds that it was expected. He points out that no evil has ever escaped these holy chains and asks Hans if he will not give up resisting, but Hans only laughs, which makes Tuscan annoyed. Hans declares he will never surrender, announcing he will leave and daring Tuscan and the others to catch him if they can. Unsure of Hans's plan, Tuscan instantly gets on guard, summoning a holy light spear and hurling it to cut off his escape. Dark magic begins engulfing around Hans, and a second later, he vanishes into thin air as the spear passes through him. Seeing Hans actually escape these bindings, Tuscan is bewildered and unable to believe it. Back in the real world, Han Sung-hyun is lying on his back, huffing and panting, having barely escaped Tuscan. Closing his eyes to rest, Han Sung-hyun admits that he has made way too many enemies now. His enemies include the Vow of Defiance, the Vampire Clan, and now even the Grand Divine Order. Suddenly, a thought strikes him as he summons the Karma Shop to check his karma points. Previously, he had been puzzled about why he received so many karma points, and now he understands. The main reason is because he has been drawing aggro across the entire continent, becoming the #1 target. Deciding to think about that later, Han Sung-hyun decides to focus now on what he originally planned. Taking back control as Hans, he goes to check on his test subjects, his familiars, to see how they are doing. It's a simple principle. The controlled entity, the familiar, spreads black magic upon encountering another, allowing Hans's eyes and ears to keep expanding. And soon, the familiars will wrap around the place in every corner. Suddenly, Hans feels a signal sent at him by a cat who seems to have noticed some movements. The cat is standing on a rooftop, looking over at a house as it sends signals to Hans. Inside that house, a woman is screaming, crying, and on the ground pleading with a man to spare her as the man is holding a knife. The woman sees someone pass by the window, turns to them, and begs the man to save her, claiming she's been kidnapped. But the man pays no heed to the woman and simply walks away as if not noticing her. The kidnapper grabs the woman by her hair and pulls her away from the window as she lets out a scream. With a grin, the kidnapper places the knife close to the woman's neck, telling her that her screams will be heard by none. Smacking her on the head, the kidnapper mocks her by daring her to scream and make more noise. Finally, he decides to finish her and raises the knife above him. At that very moment, the ceiling of the house shatters, creating a hole in it, and Hans drops down, startling the kidnapper. Hans asks the kidnapper if he was using sound suppression and invisibility skills. He notes that these tricks don't work on him and declares that the kidnapper will die now. The kidnapper holds the woman tighter and asks Hans if he is a guardian and how he got into the house. Moving the knife closer to the woman, the kidnapper warns Hans not to move ahead or the woman will die. But Hans uses his superior power and pulls the woman from the kidnapper's grasp in the blink of an eye, leaving the kidnapper bewildered. Looking angry, the kidnapper says he will now finish Hans off along with the woman, and he charges at Hans, the knife raised before him. Suddenly, dark mana threads trap the kidnapper's hand, making him unable to move. As more mana threads bind the kidnapper, rendering him immovable, Hans notes the kidnapper must have killed many victims before. Moving closer to the kidnapper, Hans places a hand on his head to find out the truth. Using his special skill, Hans begins reading the kidnapper's mind and sees that he has killed many people in the past and is a serial killer. So Hans instantly kills the serial killer, making him scream out loud in pain. As the serial killer is lifted off his feet, Hans tells him that even death is too merciful for him. Hans notes that he needs some undead to command on this earth and decides to turn this serial killer into one. Turning someone into an undead is a cruel method involving draining all the blood from the subject's body. After a few seconds, the serial killer successfully transforms into intermediate undead, a ghast. To be clear, summoning the subspace, Hans instructs the ghast to head inside. With this dealt with, Hans turns to the woman and decides to clean up the place and call 911 to make sure she is safe. A few minutes later, the entire scene gets crowded with police and reporters. Among the crowd is a man named Park Hanchul, team leader of a criminal investigation team. A man approaches Hanchul with a camera, confirming the footage from the scene and explaining the serial killer. The man also confirms that the one who killed the serial killer was a returner and says it's good the serial killer is dead. But Hanchul thinks differently and notes that the one who killed the serial killer is equally dangerous for carrying out executions on his own will. While all the investigation is going on, Hans is standing on top of the nearby building, looking down at the scene. He is holding the cat, one of his familiars, and stroking and scratching its back. At the South Korea Returners Association, located in the Southern Seoul branch, a woman enters a room asking for the branch manager. Entering the room, the woman sees with disappointment that the branch manager is fast asleep. So, she shakes Yoon Jiun, the branch manager, making Jiun wake up with a start, drooling and her eyes dark with exhaustion. Jiun asks, groggily, what the matter is, and the woman reports that the Ability Management Bureau has sent a request for cooperation. Looking at the report, Jian reads about the arrest of 3 jewel thieves and suggests it might be connected to the recent murder. The culprit in both cases is a user of dark magic, wearing a long coat and a mask. Jian puts the report over her eyes to sleep, noting the masked man might be useful, shocking the woman who points out he's a murderer. Pushing the report off her face, Jian shouts that despite being a murderer, the man has skills and could be an excellent dog if controlled. Again leaning back in her seat, Jian sighs, contemplating the possibility of the masked man joining as a guardian. The woman gets irritated and snaps at Jian, telling her to stop dodging off and go back to work. Jian screams, a mixture of rage and tiredness in her voice, claiming she wants to smash the faces of all villains to pieces. The next morning, back at his apartment, Han Song-hyun looks out of the window, feeling satisfied from smashing all those villains. Unless the villains are serial killers, Han Song-hyun usually stops at planting a curse of terror and punishing them appropriately. Next, he plans to look into those who have been causing the most chaos in public. And for now, since Han Song-hyun has most things wrapped up, he thinks he should get back to the other world. Seeing Diana and Aaron, their uncle bursts into tears and goes to hug them, overjoyed to see they are alive and well. Watching the 3 embrace and cry at their reunion, Heinz is relieved that the uncle might be a good person. Heinz had originally planned to resort to threats if the uncle had shown any suspicious behavior. Shaking Heinz's hand gratefully, the uncle thanks him for escorting the children safely, and Heinz simply tells him it's okay. Diana steps forward with tearful eyes and hugs Heinz tightly, thanking him through a mixture of sobs. Patting Diana's head, Heinz promises to visit her from time to time and tells her to be good and behave in the meantime. Diana continues crying, wailing that she was worried Heinz's personality would change, but seeing him still kind, she feels relieved. Surprised by these remarks, Heinz asks Diana if she really thinks his personality has changed. Heinz wonders if it might be the influence of persona, as the persona gave Hans a mix of negative emotions and a desire for knowledge. So, Heinz believes the persona might have given him a calm and composed personality. Diana asks Heinz what he will be doing now. Heinz says he will take the opportunity and go on a pilgrimage. The capital of Talia Kingdom, Thaleria, is a peaceful and beautiful place, and Heinz has just arrived here, and he has only one reason for being in this city. It's because Thaleria is the headquarters of the Church of the Goddess and is home to the largest temple in the land. Heinz walks into a silent alley where no one can see him and begins summoning the 4th avatar, which Han Song-hyun had acquired. The 4th avatar is named Heinrich, sharing the same traits as the other avatars. The unique trait Heinrich has is a warrior's spirit that grants him bonus skills and experience. Heinz claims that wandering around the city in a vampire's body is tough, so he hands over his small bag to Heinrich and tells him to explore the city. Heinrich heads to a church and drops the bag full of gold coins and treasures before a bald man at the counter. Shocked to see this much wealth, the baldy asks how much the treasure is worth, and Heinrich says it's his life savings. Placing a hand on his heart, Heinrich says his wish is to become a holy knight and fulfill the will of the goddess. So far, all the avatars have been undead, a dark mage, and a vampire, all related to darkness. So, this new avatar, Heinrich, will become a holy knight who wields a sacred sword and is respected by everyone. Thumping the table hard with his fist, the long-mustached man happily exclaims that Heinrich is a young, spirited man and offers to train him. The baldy tells the mustached man, Sir Marco, to wait, pointing out that no matter the donation, they can't accept a stranger as a holy knight. Laughing shrilly, Marco assures the baldy not to worry, and turning to Heinrich, Marco points out that during the training, Heinrich's true nature will be revealed and asks Heinrich if he wants that. With a confident smile, Heinrich agrees instantly. However, his confidence is wiped away when he starts the training and, huffing and puffing, realizes the training is hell. As a large boulder comes hurling toward him, he uses both his arms to stop it, applying all his force. It's already been a month since Heinrich started this holy knight training, with an initial thought that it would be easy, but it turns out he was wrong, and now he has learned the hard way that it's not easy. The boulder is so heavy that Heinrich starts sweating from supporting its weight. A muscular man, noticing trainee number 12 nearly about to get crushed, scolds him, saying his focus is slipping. Leaning closer to the nearly collapsed man, the trainer shouts at him to focus and chant his prayers. From the heavy weight of the boulder and fear of being crushed to death, the man starts changing his prayer. He then applies more force into his hands and manages to push the boulder high above, making the trainer happy. Watching this, Heinrich notes that in extreme conditions, repetitive prayer strengthens faith and enhances divine power. Meanwhile, a bald trainee is making others hit his back with spiked maces, while flexing his muscles. Another trainee is crushing an iron mace with his bare biceps. Seeing these men show off like this, Heinrich feels uncomfortable. The trainee from before tells Marco, the man with the mustache, that the recruits he brought are no joke. Those two praise Heinrich's strength, noting that even without getting baptized, he is so strong and want to see how much he will improve after baptism. Hearing those men talk about him in a perverted way, Heinrich feels even more uncomfortable and cringes hard. 3 months have passed since Heinrich started Holy Night training, and thanks to his warrior's spirit and super recovery skill, he hasn't collapsed yet. While his body and stamina have improved from the training, there's only one thing that's really bothering him. Placing a hand on Heinrich's shoulder, Jacob makes him turn around, flexes his biceps, and suggests that they do some chest exercises together. But the other man disagrees and, flexing his biceps, suggests they should instead do a solid back workout. As those two men gaze upon him like prey, Heinrich feels incredibly uncomfortable and starts trembling with unease. Later that day, after training, Heinrich tells his friend that every day those freaks come to him asking to train with them, making his friend laugh. At that moment, a crowd of people suddenly gets excited as they see someone arrive, as if they had been expecting them. The Archbishop Lacius and the Paladin, Tuscan, walk through the gate, receiving greetings and a grand welcome from everyone around. Heinrich's friend explains that the arrivals had gone on an expedition with the Holy Knights and Crusaders and have just now returned. Heinrich recognizes Tuscan as the same one who fought Hans a while ago, so Heinrich realizes Tuscan and his party must have been searching for Hans all this time. After a few days, the official baptismal ceremony for those who passed the criteria is being held in the Great Hall of the church. The priest, standing at the front on the podium, says that due to special circumstances, the ceremony has been moved up suddenly. He then instructs the trainees whose names he calls to step forward. Heinrich's friend, sitting beside him, asks why they must be holding the event, which only happens once every 6 months. Heinrich assumes that this must be because the knights desperately need reinforcements for the pursuit of the immortal king. Nevertheless, Heinrich is super pumped about this opportunity and is considering using the skills, Persona and Mind Hub. The priest calls out the trainee Max Weirin, and as Max kneels before the priest asks him to take the vow. Those who receive the baptism sacrifice all their mana to the deity and are unable to use magic, but in return, the deity bestows them a blessing of immense holy power. The size of the blessing each individual receives varies, and the greatest factor that determines it is the faith in the deity. The purer and more genuine the faith, free of lies or doubt, the stronger the holy knight they become. After Max gets baptized, the priest calls forth Heinrich. Heinrich leaves his seat and walks to the front with a serious demeanor. Until now, Han Song-hyun had used Mind Hub to suppress external stimuli or restrain his emotions, but the opposite is also possible. So Han Song-hyun uses the Persona skill to inject the emotions of faith into Heinrich. So when the priest extracts his mana, using Mind Hub to filter out distrust and doubts, Heinrich's mana becomes pure, without any hesitation. This allows Heinrich to absorb the blessing to its maximum potential as Han Song-hyun focuses the mental strength of all his avatars into Heinrich. Even the priest is astonished, seeing the amount of holy power bestowed upon Heinrich after the baptism. The holy power shines out of Heinrich, spreading into the entire hall, making everyone there shield their eyes in awe. The other trainees, sitting in their seats, are in awe, unable to believe the quantity of holy power they are witnessing. They see that the holy power has even reached the head of the statue of the deity. Placing a hand on Heinrich's shoulder, the priest calls him sir and tells him he has been baptized successfully, already reaching the priest rank. With a smile, the priest wishes Heinrich good luck for the future, and Heinrich thanks him. With this, Han Song-hyun obtains the skill, Holy Baptism, which increases the potential of avatars and their mental strength. Examining the holy power he just received, Heinrich is relieved that the fake faith built on tricks actually worked, but he is also certain the tricks he used didn't fully work because the deity of the divine church is closer to a system than a personal god. When Heinrich opened his mind earlier, he got a vague feeling that was closer to curiosity than faith. Looking up at the deity statue, Heinrich thinks this is what it means to watch over someone. Meanwhile, the Archbishop Lacius and the Paladin Tuscan are gathered in the planning room, examining a large map on the table. Tuscan looks frustrated, noting they haven't found any traces of the immortal king in months and won't get support from the Talia kingdom. Pointing to the symbols on the map, he notes that their pursuit of Hans caused too much friction with the vampire clan and the vow of defiance. Lacius points out that since the extermination squad hasn't made any progress, the political pressure from the Talia kingdom is increasing. Feeling his forehead in all this tension, Lacius declares that the extermination squad will be dismissed, and Tuscan agrees with him. Walking out of the hall, Tuscan thinks to himself that they are now surrounded on all sides with insufficient reinforcements. He isn't certain what to do or how to act in this case. While lost in thought, he gets startled by screams and looks down to see the newly appointed knight's training. Max sees a gap and thrusts his spear and inflicts damage on Heinrich, who groans out in pain. Heinrich counters by elbowing Max right across his face, breaking his nose. The attack sends Max crashing to the ground, and Heinrich is declared the winner as the system awards him the Crusader combat technique skill for repeated training. Combining super recovery with his holy power, Heinrich instantly heals the wound he received from the spear. Taking Heinrich's hand to help him stand, Max asks if he just let himself get hit on purpose, and Heinrich affirms that he did. Heinrich got attacked on purpose to help with his training and become stronger. Max gasps in shock, and as Heinrich turns around, they find Tuscan standing nearby, commenting on Heinrich's power. Standing close to Heinrich and looking at him, Tuscan offers to make him stronger and asks him to accompany him to the Rosalia temple. Shocked at the offer, Heinrich asks Tuscan if he really means to invite him to the Rosalia Grand Temple, and Tuscan affirms. Turning around to leave, Tuscan instructs the still-shocked Heinrich to follow after him immediately. Running after Tuscan, Heinrich asks if he can pack his belongings, but Tuscan tells Heinrich to have someone handle that later. As both of them stand on the teleportation circle, Tuscan promises to explain all details to Heinrich later. Still looking surprised, Heinrich agrees. A second later, the two of them teleport outside the boundaries of Rosalia Grand Temple, leaving Heinrich in awe with its beauty. This temple is the largest sanctuary of the Divine Church, located at the heart of the continent. It's the very place where both the Pope and the Saintess reside, the heart of the church itself. The Saintess, Ristar, welcomes both Heinrich and Tuscan, looking delighted to host them. Both of them bow before Ristar as Tuscan thanks her. Meanwhile, Heinrich is making plans with himself on how he will grow rapidly here and become a holy knight recognized by all. Smirking slightly at this idea, Heinrich plans to grow steadily in the light. The rest of the dirty work will be handled by the other avatars in the shadows. Back on Earth, Han Song-hyun, in Hansa's body, is going through the internet, finding himself trending all over the place and becoming famous. His mind races to the other matter when the villains he killed recently had mentioned the Divine Retribution Society, and he wonders what it might be. Getting to his feet, Han Song-hyun decides to figure it out later, focusing on wiping out the villains and settling the mission's earnings. Taking control of Heinz, he covers his head with a hood and his face with a mask and makes his way through the busy streets. To make the transactions, he goes to a decent and less suspicious place. Once he enters the place, the owner of the shop welcomes him. Walking up to the shop owner, Heinz places a small bag on the table, declaring he wants to sell. But the shop owner, immersed in reading a book, lazily says it's not a pawn shop and tells Heinz to go away. Heinz empties the bag on the counter, showering it with lots of coins, startling the shop owner. Examining the coins, the shop owner recognizes them as badges of the human trafficking group, the Commerce Syndicate. Heinz asks the shop owner if he is interested now. Looking a little scared, the shop owner tells Heinz to go through the back door. Listening to the man, Heinz opens the back door, and as he enters, a man in a mask welcomes him, asking if he is there to sell. Presenting the bag to the man in the mask, Heinz asks if it's possible to get paid something other than cash. Examining the badges, the masked man asks if Heinz means he wants goods. Raising one finger, Heinz says he wants a first-prize lottery ticket, because he knows that cash is useless if he can't spend it, so a lottery prize will be legally usable cash for Han Song-hyun. The man in the mask says that for a lottery ticket, the commission will be pretty steep, and Heinz agrees to it. The masked man claims there's a 6.1 billion won ticket price with a 4-month redemption period left, and Heinz asks him to prepare 2 more like that. Surprised at this request, the masked man points out that with what Heinz has paid so far, it won't be enough for 2 tickets. Assuring the man not to worry, Heinz reaches into his subspace, withdraws 3 gold bars, and places them on the counter. Shocked to see Heinz has access to subspace storage, the man grabs his hand, asking who he is. Taken aback at being grabbed like this, Heinz sternly tells the man he isn't here to have a friendly chat and suggests they just get over with the deal. Releasing Heinz's arm, the man apologizes and agrees they should wrap up. The man begins sweating, feeling really intimidated by the presence of Heinz now. Leaning closer to the man's ear, Heinz tells him they will keep doing these trades often from now on. A few minutes later, Heinz walks out of the store with 3 lottery tickets and is very excited, wondering what he should spend them on. He is actually considering hiring some subordinates he can boss around for stuff like this instead of going back and forth himself. But for now, he decides to enjoy the night air peacefully for a while. Sitting on the side, Heinz watches the crowd, satisfied that he's the reason behind their peace, with no more crimes to worry about. Right then, a man appears behind Heinz and asks him where he is from. Startled at this sudden appearance of the person, Heinz turns around swiftly in alarm. The man calmly says he just wants to have a chat and that's all. Heinz asks the man what he is talking about and calls him out for sneaking up on others like this. The man asks Heinz if he isn't a vampire or not, and he shows off his own fangs, saying he is also a vampire, a level 6 from the mirror dimension. Hearing there's another dimension-traveling vampire, Heinz is completely bewildered for a moment. The vampire seems to be asserting dominance, which makes Heinz introduce himself despite not wanting to. Realizing he's answering so easily, Heinz is even more baffled, thinking the vampire can mind control. The vampire then introduces himself as Gamma, from the Blood Pact organization, and hands over a card to Heinz. Taking the card, Heinz asks if such an organization really exists, and Gamma points out that for vampires to survive together, the organization is important. Heinz asks Gamma what is the level thing he mentioned earlier. Taking out his car keys, Gamma turns it on and suggests Heinz join him to get more explanation. As Heinz gets into the car, a woman is keeping a close watch on him from the other end of the road. She is also a vampire, and she speaks into the earpiece to alert the headquarters that Heinz is moving as planned.